My mind often swims with what ifs. What if, as opposed to following some predetermined path of who we're supposed to be or the life we're supposed to live, what if we could live authentically? What if we could be the narrators of our very own stories? What if we could be the architects of our own lives? What if through living authentically in connection with ourselves, we could actually then start to authentically and empathically connect with other people? The first rogue adventurers of the what if movement in my life were my mom and my dad. It was 1970s in India, and they met, and they were arranged to be married. It was a very quick courtship. Now, if my mom and dad had done what their mom and dad before them had done, then they would have stayed in a village, which, by the way, they were brought up in very, very humble, modest beginnings. No running water, no electricity. They would have stayed in the village. They would have passed down cultural traditions, religious values, educational hopes to their children, and they would have raised generations from there. But that's not what they did. Instead, my mom and dad, my rogue adventurers, decided to turn their world upside down and inside out, and they left behind everything that was familiar and known, everything that was comforting, and they took off to go to the US, where they faced every single what if they'd never anticipated to face. Now, the story of my parents' acculturation was not an easy one. My mother, she had been a practicing physician in India, and when she came to the US, she had to repeat her residency from the beginning all over again. And my father, as opposed to taking an easy path, decided to start his own business in a foreign land with no resources to his name at all. Now, I remember hearing stories of mom and dad's acculturation. There was one where it was probably her first few days in the US, and it was a Midwestern winter. You had a few feet of snow around you, and mom's in a traditional Indian sari with open-toed shoes, standing in front of the mailbox with a letter in hand, trying to figure out exactly how to get it to go. And she doesn't know about opening the hood and lifting the flag. And so there she waits in the Midwest snow, hoping that there's going to be relief and rescue on the way. Luckily there was, in the form of a neighbor who came by and taught my mom where to buy a big warm winter coat and where to get her first pair of snow boots, and also educated her on the US postal system. Now, my parents, through much hard work and trial and tribulation, were able to be successful enough to sponsor the immigration of close to my whole family from India. So the aunts and the uncles and the cousins and the grandparents, they all came from India, and we all lived together in a sort of grand central station of love. Now, I was raised in this village, and it really took every member of the tribe to contain my craziness. And there's this story of me being about 3 years old, and I would try to scale walls, I would climb furniture. I remember being told that I would go head to head with the brick fireplace. So here I am, 3 years old, going head to head with the brick fireplace, trying to scale. Brick fireplace wins, and I'm left as a toddler with a giant head wound and this open gash. Now, my little traditional Indian grandmother comes running through because in her mind, turmeric powder is the cure to anything and everything. It will resolve every ailment. So here comes Ba running over with the turmeric powder, and she's pouring just teaspoons into the open wound in my forehead. And my uncle sees whoa, turmeric powder alone isn't gonna do it. She needs something else. He throws me in the car, and he speeds me away to the emergency room. where we're met by my mom and my dad and a very, very perplexed Western doctor who takes a step back and is kind of inspecting why this child with a head wound has turmeric powder in her skull. And it's because we did the only thing that we know how to do. You just lean in authentically with as much love as you possibly have, and you do the only thing you can in that moment, which is rally for the people in your village and rally for the people in your tribe. So we had these stories and we had these crazy memories, and I was raised by a motto that my dad just repeated. It was a mantra. He'd always say, figure out what you love, find your passion, and then figure out how to get paid for it. So I got to go through life kind of testing and trying different things, and I was really quite a scrapper, so I thought law school is the way for me. But as I started studying for my LSAT, I realized law school is not for me. And then I thought maybe I want to be an entrepreneur and really get my MBA, but that wasn't my path either. It was actually psychology. Psychology, the art and the science of interpersonal connectivity, of understanding human behavior, of understanding our emotional processes, that was my path. And I went to school for a long time, 6 years after college, to be exact. And during those 6 years of grad school, I learned about empirically validated research. I learned about the very best practices for depression and anxiety and everything in between. I learned about diagnosing safely and accurately. I learned about managing symptoms. But there was so much that I had not learned. And it wasn't until I started beginning internship that I learned how much I didn't learn, and his name was Little Xavier. And I think of him now with his big eyes and his bow tie. He was a foster child. He was 6 years old, and he was being raised by a foster grandmother. And though she had this abundance of love and nurturance for this little guy, she had so many physical limitations and ailments, she simply couldn't keep up with the demands of a little one. And so it was my first session with little Xavier, and I was ready to go, right out of grad school, ready to heal and save and transform. And he walks in the room, and he walks right past me, and he goes straight under a table where he sits and avoids eye contact and avoids words and refuses to engage with me for the entire 50-minute therapeutic hour. So this was not therapy, this was not healing, this was not transformative, this was an absolute epic failure. Next week, little Xavier comes back in, walks right past me, right under the table. This time, I think back to the way that I was raised. And I do the only thing that I know to do, which is get under the table with them. So together we sit. Eventually, we start sharing some words. We share time, we share space, and the words, they turn into therapy. And eventually, he leaves the table and he comes over to the sand tray on his tiptoes. Little Xavier, always on his tiptoes. And he starts playing and reenacting a scene of his trauma where mommy is buried deep in the sand. And there's a search party of men moving through the sandbox with no avail, looking for mommy, not giving up, never, ever successful. And every week, he would reenact some form of the same trauma. Now, one day, I was waiting for him, and I'm sitting down on a couch next to a shag carpet, and little Xavier comes bounding in the room, and he sees the big fluffy shag carpet, and he takes off his shoes, and he takes off his socks, and he buries his toes in there, and I'm laughing, and I'm smiling until I'm not, until I'm overcome with a look of horror and terror and fear and sadness, and he sees this, and he grabs his socks and he grabs his shoes and his tear-streaked face and he runs back to under the table, because in those moments, I understood little Xavier's trauma in a very different way. His feet, from the balls of his feet all the way up through the arches, were riddled in constellations of cigarette burns. And that is why he was not with his mother. And that is why he was always on his tiptoes, always on his tiptoes. And so I'd lost him for that moment, but I knew I needed to reconnect. So back under the table we went. And eventually, although we had a therapeutic setback, we were able to lean in and work through it, and I sat with him in his fear and his distress and his discomfort of actually being seen for more than his big eyes and his bow tie, but being seen for his pain and his trauma. And we got back out from under the table and we got back to therapeutic work and we reconnected and the process of healing went on. And then my 1 year came up. And my rotation at that site was done, and it was time to have the termination talk. And so I remember calling him over and saying, "Hey, little Xavier, buddy, it's been such an awesome year, and it's been such a huge honor to work with you. You're amazing. My time here is all done, but you're going to have a new feelings friend, and she's going to be so lucky because she's going to pick up right where we left off, and she's going to get to hang out with you." And he saw straight through my words, and the words that he said are like etched into my soul. He said, "I know what will happen. You will go away, and I will cry because I will be alone, because everybody goes away." And I didn't want to be one more person buried in the sandbox of his life, one more force that came in and abruptly came out, but I knew I couldn't stay. I could only hope that what we had had and what we had created would be transformative enough for him to let somebody else into his life, for him to know that if an adult comes to you and says, "I'm going to see you next week," they'll actually show up. After leaving that year of internship, I went on to the next year and the next year. And over the course of the years, the what ifs they went off like fireworks in my head. What if I didn't have to leave a kiddo? What if I could stay with a child or an adolescent or a family until they didn't need that containment? What if it could be long term? What if they could be part of my grand central station of love and I could give that to them without having to say goodbye, while still taking all of those amazing things from graduate school, the empirically validated treatment, the best practices, and weaving it all together? And so that's what I did. I created my own practice where the beanbags were big enough to envelop little bodies, and the nurturance was reflected in every single thing that we did. And I remember Lily being one of my clients early on. And when Lily came to me, she was in the midst of her parents having the most contentious divorce. Remember Lily wanting to connect with mom and lean in, but feeling that doing so was at the expense of dad. And Lily talking about how she really wanted to connect with dad, but she just desperately didn't want to betray mom. And by the time she got to me, Lily had been interviewed by child protective service workers, mediators, court attorneys, more people than a child ever needs to be interrogated by. And so we tried to get Lily out of her head and away from the noise and into the moment. She joined our therapeutic equine program, where she got on a horse and rode through trails and turned off the noise and figured out how it actually felt to just be in the moment. She joined our after-school program where she sat side by side with kids her own age, talking about her feelings and her thoughts, learning to self-advocate, learning how to say, you know what, it's not okay. It's not right and it's not fair that I'm being forced to choose between two people that I love the most, and this isn't good for me. And Lily's prognosis was awesome, and she was doing so good. And then I got the phone call that took me to my knees and humbled me in a way that I have never been impacted before. Lily's mother had committed suicide. The process of watching her family system that she had built and committed her life to deteriorating in front of her was more than she could bear. And in those moments, my head exploded with every maladaptive, paralyzing what if. What if we had a court system that actually focused on healing as opposed to division of assets and, financial deconstruction? What if we had attorneys who put kids before dollar signs? And every what if filled me with so much fear and rage and doubt that it pulled me further and further and further away from where it was I needed to be, which was leaning in fully to Lily. So, much like I did with little Xavier, I sat next to Lily on the ground because that was the only place grounding enough for either one of us to be. And we sat together, and we shared the time, and we shared the space, and I witnessed her rage, and her tears, and her scream, and her panic, and her trauma. And eventually, her trauma turned into pain, and her pain turned into words, and her words turned into therapeutic healing. And then just like that, a giant wave of trauma would come right back and take her right where she was when she had started. But we were in it together. Now, you guys, life is never, ever guaranteed to be easy, and we're all gonna face adversity. But what if as opposed to trying to go through it alone, we had somebody to witness us, to hold our pain, to wrap us up in a grand central station of love, to know that through every trial and tribulation, we were part of something bigger than just ourselves. I still see Lily once, twice a week, and I lean in, and there's good moments and there's traumatic moments, but at the end of the day, she knows that somebody is truly, authentically, empathically leaning in wholeheartedly, doing what her parents taught her to do, trying to create a grand central station of love all around her. And that's really all we can do.